If you can afford the worst room, I'll give you the suite, though we both know people like you can't even afford the lobby air. Douglas Harlan let the insult hang there, loud enough for every guest in line to hear. His gaze dragged over Calvin Rhodes's simple clothes, dismissive, amused. Five-star properties have standards, he added smoothly. We can't just let anyone wander in off the street. A woman behind Calvin smirked. Douglas leaned forward, lowering his voice just enough to feel personal. So, go ahead, he said, tapping the counter. Show me something that proves you belong here. Calvin didn't blink. His palm rested flat against the marble, heartbeat slow, expression unreadable. Douglas mistook silence for weakness. He had no idea he was publicly belittling the majority owner of the very hotel whose keys he believed only he controlled. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you can't miss. The automatic glass doors of the Grand Meridian Hotel whispered open as Calvin Rhodes stepped into the marble-floored lobby. The late afternoon sun streamed through towering windows, catching the crystal chandeliers and casting dancing light across the space. Calvin's worn jeans and faded denim jacket stood in stark contrast to the polished opulence around him. He adjusted the strap of his weathered duffel bag, taking in the elaborate flower arrangements and gilt-framed mirrors with the careful eye of someone who noticed every detail. At the front desk, Douglas Harlan's lips curled into a sneer as he watched Calvin's approach. The manager's perfectly pressed suit and slicked-back hair embodied the very image of corporate polish. Sophia Bennett, working the far end of the counter, glanced up from checking in an elderly couple. She caught the familiar look of disdain spreading across her supervisor's face and felt her stomach tighten. "Can I help you?" Douglas's voice dripped with condescension as Calvin reached the desk. "I believe the budget motels are a few blocks down." Calvin set his bag down carefully. "I'd like a room for the week, please." "Sir," Douglas drew out the word like it pained him, raising his voice so nearby guests could hear. "This is the Grand Meridian. Our most basic rooms start at $500 per night." "That won't be a problem," Calvin replied evenly. Douglas's laugh was sharp and theatrical. "Tell you what, if you can afford even our worst room, I'll give you the presidential suite." He gestured to two security guards, who began moving closer. "We have certain standards to maintain." The elderly couple Sophia had been helping paused their departure, watching the scene unfold. Other guests in the lobby stopped their conversations, creating a thick silence broken only by the gentle splash of the marble fountain. "Standards." Calvin's voice remained calm, though his jaw tightened slightly. "Would you mind elaborating on those standards?" "Well," Douglas smoothed his tie, "we cater to a certain caliber of guest. People who understand proper attire, proper behavior." His eyes flicked meaningfully over Calvin's clothes. People who fit in. Sophia's hands clenched beneath the counter. She opened her mouth to speak, but Calvin caught her eye and gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head. Instead, he reached into his jacket and withdrew a thick envelope. With deliberate slowness, he counted out crisp $100 bills onto the polished counter. 7 nights in the presidential suite. That should cover it, with a generous deposit. The stack of cash sat between them like a challenge. Douglas's face flushed red as nearby guests exchanged whispers. After a long moment, he pushed a key card across the counter. Not for the presidential suite, but clearly for a standard room. "Room 407, he said through clenched teeth. "4th floor." His forced smile looked more like a grimace. "Welcome to the Grand Meridian." Calvin picked up the key with the same careful dignity he'd shown throughout the exchange. As he turned toward the elevators, Douglas leaned close to one of the security guards. "Keep an eye on him," he muttered. "I want to know everywhere he goes." The elevator doors slid closed on Calvin's solitary figure. When they opened again on the 4th floor, he walked down a hallway with worn carpet and flickering fluorescent lights. Clearly, the least maintained section of the hotel. Room 407's door stuck slightly as he opened it. Inside, the room was small and dated. The wallpaper showed signs of peeling, and the single window overlooked the parking garage. Calvin set his bag on the sagging bed and pulled out a leather-bound notebook and pen. His movements were unhurried as he began to write, documenting every detail of the interaction downstairs. His pen moved steadily across the page, recording Douglas's words verbatim, the positions of the security guards, the reactions of other guests. He noted the exact time, the number of witnesses, and even the way Douglas had deliberately handed him the key card with barely 2 fingers, as if avoiding contact. The setting sun cast long shadows across the room's faded carpet as Calvin continued writing. His face remained composed, but his grip on the pen tightened slightly when he reached the part about standards. Below his careful notes, he began a new section titled Immediate Observations, his handwriting precise and measured. The room's air conditioner rattled to life with a concerning sound, but Calvin didn't look up from his task. He simply added room conditions as another bullet point in his growing list, followed by detailed descriptions of every maintenance issue he could see. The single lamp on the bedside table cast weak light across his notebook as darkness began to fall outside the grimy window. In the dim room, Calvin's figure was straight-backed and focused, his demeanor as dignified as it had been in the lobby. He wrote with the dedication of someone who knew the power of details, of documentation, of patience. The pen moved steadily across the page, recording every slight, every coded word, every subtle and not-so-subtle form of discrimination he had encountered in the past hour. Calvin sat at the small desk, its laminate surface scratched and worn, methodically reviewing a stack of hotel brochures under the weak desk lamp. His notebook lay open beside them, pages filling with precise observations. The glossy marketing materials promised luxury and impeccable service, claims that stood in stark contrast to his current surroundings. A sudden aggressive pounding on the door broke the quiet. Calvin glanced at his watch. 9:47 p.m. "Security! Open up!" The voice was unnecessarily loud. Calvin took a deliberate breath before opening the door. The same 2 guards from the lobby stood there, shoulders squared imposingly. "We've received noise complaints from neighboring rooms," the taller guard announced, trying to peer past Calvin into the room. Calvin raised an eyebrow. "Noise complaints? I've been sitting here reading." "Sir, we have to investigate all complaints," the second guard said, his hand resting meaningfully on his radio. "Hotel policy." "Of course," Calvin replied calmly. "Though it's interesting that anyone could hear anything through these concrete walls." He gestured to the solid structure. "Especially when I haven't made a sound." The guards exchanged glances, but found no reason to push further. They retreated down the hallway, muttering into their radios. Calvin had just settled back at the desk when another knock came, this time lighter. A woman in a housekeeping uniform stood in the hallway, pushing a cleaning cart. "Evening service," she called out cheerfully, though her smile seemed forced. "I didn't request evening service," Calvin said. "Oh," she checked her clipboard with exaggerated surprise. "So sorry, wrong room." She hurried away, but not before Calvin noticed her cart was empty of supplies. He documented each interruption in his notebook, noting times, employee descriptions, and their exact words. The pattern was clear: systematic harassment, designed to make him uncomfortable enough to leave. At 11:52 p.m., returning from getting ice, Calvin's keycard failed. The small red light blinked mockingly as he tried repeatedly to open his door. He stood there, ice bucket in hand, considering his options. Soft footsteps approached from behind. "I'm so sorry," Sophia whispered, glancing nervously down the hall. "Here." She quickly swiped a master keycard, opening his door. "Thank you, Ms. Bennett," Calvin said quietly. She wrung her hands. "Mr. Rhodes, I need to tell you something." Her voice shook slightly. "What happened in the lobby? It wasn't an isolated incident. Mr. Harlan, She swallowed hard. "He has a pattern of profiling black guests, makes up reasons to deny them rooms, pushes them toward canceling reservations, encourages complaints against them." Calvin's expression remained neutral, but his eyes were sharp and focused. "How long has this been happening?" "The whole time I've worked here. 2 years." Sophia's voice dropped even lower. "He pressures the staff to help him do it. If we don't comply—" She left the threat unspoken. "What's the employee turnover rate?" Calvin asked, pulling out his notebook. "High, especially among minority staff." Sophia glanced over her shoulder again. "Most don't last 6 months. HR reports to Douglas directly, and the corporate office—" She shrugged helplessly. "Who oversees Mr. Harlan?" "Technically the regional VP, but they're old golf buddies. Douglas brags about it." Sophia's face showed her disgust. "The owner is some investor group. They're never here." Calvin wrote each detail carefully. "Have any employees filed formal complaints?" "A few tried. They were gone within weeks." "Performance issues." Sophia's bitter air quotes made her feelings clear. "I've documented everything I've seen, but—" She straightened suddenly as footsteps echoed from around the corner. "I should go. I'm sorry about your keycard." "It will probably happen again." She hurried away just as a security guard appeared, pretending to check a fire extinguisher while watching Calvin enter his room. Meanwhile, in his first-floor office, Douglas Harlan leaned back in his leather chair, sharing a laugh with the head of security. "You should have seen his face when I gave him that garbage room," Douglas chuckled, swirling his whiskey. "These people need to learn their place. Can't have them thinking they can just walk in here and damage our image." "Want us to keep the pressure on tonight?" the security chief asked. "Oh, yes," Douglas smirked. "Make him regret ever stepping foot in my hotel. By morning, he'll be begging to check out early." Back in room 407, Calvin stood at the window, gazing out at Atlanta's glittering skyline. The city lights reflected in his eyes as he reviewed his notes from the evening. His initial plan had been to stay only long enough to document the lobby incident, but the scope of the situation was clearly much larger. He pulled out his phone, canceled his meetings for the next few days, and added a new section to his notes titled "Extended Observation Required." The systematic nature of the discrimination, the staff coercion, the corporate complicity, it all needed to be thoroughly documented. Down in the lobby, Douglas was reviewing the next day's VIP arrivals list, making notes about room upgrades and welcome amenities. His pen stopped abruptly at one name. The color drained from his face as he read it again, recognition dawning. The crystal whiskey glass in his hand trembled slightly, drops spilling onto the paper. Morning light streamed through the Grand Meridian's soaring lobby windows, catching the crystal chandeliers and sending rainbow reflections dancing across the marble floors. Douglas Harlan stood at attention behind the front desk, straightening his already perfect tie for the 5th time in as many minutes. "Everything must be perfect for Ms. Vance's arrival," he barked at the staff scurrying around him. "Polish that brass again. Straighten those flowers. Where are the fresh-baked cookies? They should be out by now." Sophia Bennett arranged welcome cards with practiced efficiency, watching Douglas's increasing agitation with quiet interest. His usual smug confidence had given way to something closer to desperation. "Ms. Vance is one of our most valued VIP guests," Douglas lectured, pacing behind the desk. "She's a major tech entrepreneur and philanthropist. Her company alone books hundreds of room nights annually. If anything goes wrong with her stay, I'll personally—" The lobby doors swung open, and Eleanor Vance strode in, her silver hair gleaming, designer suit impeccably tailored. She carried herself with the easy confidence of someone used to commanding rooms. Douglas rushed forward, arms spread in welcome. "Ms. Vance! What an honor to—" But Eleanor walked right past him as if he were invisible, her face lighting up at the sight of someone else. Calvin Rhodes had just stepped out of the elevator, still in his casual clothes from yesterday. "Calvin!" Eleanor called out warmly, embracing him like an old friend. "Or should I say, Mr. Rhodes?" The lobby fell silent. Guests paused mid-conversation. A bellhop nearly dropped his luggage cart. "Eleanor," Calvin replied with genuine warmth. "Right on time, as always." Douglas stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, as Eleanor linked her arm through Calvin's. "I can't believe you're doing another one of your undercover visits," Eleanor said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Though I suppose as the majority owner, you have every right to check up on your investment." Douglas's face went from red to white so quickly it was almost impressive. Several staff members gasped audibly. "Owner?" Douglas choked out. Calvin turned to face him, his expression neutral but his eyes sharp. "Yes, Mr. Harlan. I own 51% of the Grand Meridian Hotel Group. Have for the past 15 years. His voice carried clearly across the hushed lobby. "Though I prefer to evaluate my properties personally from time to time, it's amazing what you learn as a guest rather than an owner." Douglas swayed slightly on his feet. "Sir, I had no idea. If I had known—" "That's rather the point, isn't it?" Calvin said mildly. "Tell me, what were your exact words yesterday?" "Ah, yes. If you can afford the worst room, I'll give you the suite." He let the quote hang in the air as several guests winced at the memory. Eleanor's grip on Calvin's arm tightened slightly. "Calvin, darling, please tell me you're not letting this go unchecked." "No," Calvin replied, his voice taking on a steelier edge. "In fact, given what I've observed in just one night, the targeted harassment, the discriminatory practices, the staff coercion, I'm initiating a complete integrity audit of this location, effective immediately." Douglas's hands began to tremble. "Sir, I can explain—" "I'll be remaining on site to personally oversee the investigation," Calvin continued, as if Douglas hadn't spoken. "We'll be examining everything: guest complaints, security footage, hiring practices, financial records. All of it." The lobby had become so quiet, you could hear the fountain trickling in the corner. Douglas's attempt at a professional smile looked more like a grimace. Of course, sir," he managed. "I'll have your belongings moved to the presidential suite right away." "That won't be necessary," Calvin cut him off. "I'll stay right where I am. Room 407 provides an excellent perspective on how this hotel really operates." Eleanor unsuccessfully tried to hide her smile behind her hand. Several staff members were now openly staring at Douglas, years of pent-up resentment visible in their expressions. Calvin turned to Sophia, who stood wide-eyed behind the front desk. "Ms. Bennett, please continue your regular duties as normal, though I suspect we'll be speaking more in the coming days." Sophia nodded, straightening her shoulders. "Yes, Mr. Rhodes. Now," Calvin addressed Douglas again, "I believe you have some calls to make to prepare for the audit team's arrival, though I'd appreciate it if you'd refrain from having security perform any more routine checks on my room tonight." Douglas backed away, nearly tripping over his own feet in his haste to reach his office. The moment his door closed, he collapsed into his chair, hands shaking as he pulled out his phone. He jabbed at the screen several times before managing to dial the right number. "Kingston," he hissed when the call connected. "Harold, we have a serious problem. That owner you said was just a silent investor? He's here, in the hotel, right now." He lowered his voice further. "And he knows. He knows everything." In the lobby, life gradually resumed its normal rhythm, though the energy had shifted dramatically. Staff members moved with new purpose, guests whispered among themselves, and Eleanor Vance had settled into a plush armchair, apparently in no hurry to check in. Calvin stood in the center of it all, quietly observing the ripples of change already spreading through his hotel. He pulled out his notebook and made another entry, the same careful handwriting as before, but now there was no need to hide what he was writing. Calvin sat at the polished conference table, methodically arranging stacks of documents while afternoon sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Eleanor Vance perched in a leather chair beside him, her reading glasses balanced on the tip of her nose as she reviewed personnel files. "Look at this pattern," Calvin said, his voice measured but tight with controlled anger. He slid a spreadsheet across to Eleanor. Every discrimination complaint from the past 3 years, buried under miscellaneous guest feedback. Not a single one properly investigated. Eleanor's perfectly manicured nail traced down the column of dates and names. 37 incidents, all marked resolved with no follow-up documentation. She shook her head in disgust. And those are just the ones who filed formal complaints. Calvin picked up another folder, this one thick with financial statements. The renovation budget from last quarter, $6 million allocated. He spread out several invoices, but only $4 million in actual improvements. The rest went to vendors I've never heard of. Shell companies, Eleanor asked, reaching for one of the suspicious invoices. Most likely. Look at the addresses. Calvin pointed to several lines. All P.O. boxes, no websites, no business registration records I can find. A soft knock at the door made them both look up. Sophia Bennett stood in the doorway, clutching a manila envelope to her chest. She glanced nervously down the hallway before slipping inside and closing the door. "Mr. Rhodes," she said quietly, "I found something you should see." Calvin gestured to an empty chair. "Please, sit, and thank you for coming forward." Sophia's hands trembled slightly as she opened the envelope. "These are the internal promotion records from the past 5 years. I started tracking patterns after what happened to Marcus in housekeeping." She spread out several spreadsheets, each carefully annotated with dates, names, and qualifications. Every minority employee who applied for management positions. All their credentials, experience, customer satisfaction scores. She pointed to a column of red marks. All denied. Every single one. Eleanor leaned forward, studying the meticulous documentation. "And the successful candidates? Less qualified in almost every case," Sophia said. "But they fit Mr. Harlan's idea of the right image." Her voice carried years of quiet observation and carefully contained anger. Calvin made several notes in his leather-bound notebook. "This is excellent work, Ms. Bennett. Would you be willing to testify to this if necessary?" Sophia squared her shoulders. "Yes, sir." It's time someone did. Meanwhile, 12 floors up in a corner suite, Douglas Harlan paced anxiously, while Harold Kingston stood at the window, his silver hair catching the afternoon light. "He's going through everything," Douglas said, his usual polish cracking. "Financial records, complaints, personnel files. It's only a matter of time before—" "Calm down," Harold interrupted, his voice cold and precise. "This is precisely why we've been quietly acquiring shares for the past year. Rhodes may own 51% now, but that can change." Douglas stopped pacing. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Harold turned from the window, "that several board members are already concerned about Rhodes's progressive management style. They feel he's too focused on diversity initiatives and community programs instead of maximizing profits. But his results are irrelevant," Harold cut in. "What matters is perception. And the perception we're going to create is that Rhodes has lost objectivity, that his personal crusade is damaging shareholder value." Douglas sank into an armchair. "You really think you can override a majority shareholder?" Harold's thin lips curved into something approaching a smile. "With enough proxy votes and the right legal pressure? Absolutely. Leave the board to me. Your job is to maintain control here and make sure no more staff members get creative with their record-keeping." Back in the conference room, Calvin closed another file with a controlled exhale. The afternoon had stretched into early evening, and the stack of disturbing evidence had grown steadily larger. "We'll need to bring in forensic accountants," Eleanor said, rubbing her temples, "and probably civil rights attorneys." Calvin nodded, his expression grave. "This goes deeper than Douglas. Someone's been helping him hide these patterns for years." "Kingston," Eleanor suggested. "He's had his eye on your shares since day one." "Likely." Calvin stood, stretching his back. "But first, I need to see how deep this culture of discrimination really goes." He made his way down to the lobby, now busy with evening check-ins. Staff moved efficiently between tasks, but there was a new tension in the air. Everyone knew the owner was watching. Calvin positioned himself near a cluster of potted palms, observing the ebb and flow of guests and employees. A security supervisor stood nearby, briefing two new guards. Their voices carried clearly in the marble-lined space. "Remember," the supervisor said in low tones, "we maintain standards here. If you see certain types hanging around the lobby or bar, discourage them. Make your presence known. Check their key cards repeatedly if you have to. They'll get the message." Calvin's jaw tightened, his fingers pressing hard into his notebook. The supervisor's words confirmed his worst fears. The discrimination wasn't just policy. It was embedded in the daily operations, passed down like toxic tradition from veteran staff to new hires. He watched as the guards nodded their understanding, already scanning the lobby with newly trained eyes, judging who belonged and who didn't, based on nothing more than appearance. The same way Douglas had judged him just yesterday. The same way Calvin had been judged his entire life, even as he built this hotel empire from nothing. Morning light filtered through the Grand Meridian's crystal chandeliers, casting prismatic patterns across the ballroom's cream-colored walls. Department heads filed in quietly, their hushed conversations echoing off the high ceiling. At the front of the room, Calvin Rhodes stood beside a projector screen, his posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp as steel. Douglas Harlan strutted in late, shooting confident smiles to his allies. He chose a seat near Harold Kingston, who sat stone-faced in the back row, tablet computer balanced on his knee. The room hummed with tension as Calvin stepped to the podium. "Good morning," Calvin said, his voice carrying easily through the space. "I apologize for the early hour, but what I'm about to share couldn't wait." He clicked a remote, and the screen behind him filled with graphs and statistics. These charts represent guest complaints over the past 3 years. Calvin gestured to a series of red bars. Specifically, complaints about discriminatory treatment. Notice how many were marked resolved, without investigation. Douglas shifted in his seat, his collar suddenly feeling tight. Several department heads leaned forward, squinting at the numbers. "But perhaps numbers don't tell the full story," Calvin continued, pressing another button. The room filled with Douglas's voice, recorded clear as day. "Keep those people out of the bar area. I don't care what excuse you use. Tell them it's reserved for platinum members or whatever. Just get them out." Gasps rippled through the audience. Douglas's face flushed dark red as more recordings played. His casual slurs, his instructions to security, his mockery of guests who didn't fit his preferred image. Sophia Bennett stood from her seat in the front row, hands trembling, but voice steady. "I can confirm these recordings. I've witnessed similar incidents personally." She turned to face her colleagues. "Many of us have stayed silent out of fear, but Mr. Rhodes has given us the courage to speak up." Calvin nodded to her before continuing. "The discrimination extends beyond our guests." He clicked through slides showing promotion statistics, pay disparities, and buried HR complaints. Qualified minority staff consistently passed over. Wage gaps that can't be explained by performance or experience. A pattern so clear it could only be intentional. The financial evidence came next. Spreadsheets, invoices, bank transfers, all pointing to systematic fraud. $6 million in renovation funds, Calvin explained, with only $4 million in actual improvements. The rest vanished into shell companies that, coincidentally, share a mailing address with Mr. Harlan's personal LLC. Douglas's smirk had completely vanished now. He glanced desperately at Harold Kingston, who remained eerily calm. "Given the severity of these findings," Calvin announced, "I am immediately suspending Douglas Harlan pending a formal board vote on his termination. Security will escort him from the premises after—" "I'm afraid that won't be necessary." Harold Kingston's voice cut through the room like ice. He stood slowly, straightening his expensive suit. "In fact, none of this will be necessary." Calvin turned to face him, one eyebrow raised. "Excuse me?" "You see," Harold continued, producing a thick folder of documents, "while you've been playing detective, I've been busy as well." He began distributing papers to the other board members present. Through various holding companies and aligned investors, we now control 49% of Grand Meridian shares. And I have proxy agreements from 3 other shareholders. Murmurs erupted around the room. Harold's thin lips curved into something approaching a smile. Which means, Mr. Rhodes, that your majority control is now in question. I call for an immediate vote of no confidence in Calvin Rhodes's leadership. On what grounds? Calvin demanded, his voice still steady despite the sudden shift. Mismanagement of company resources, Harold replied smoothly. Using corporate assets to pursue personal vendettas. Damaging shareholder value with unnecessary investigations and diversity initiatives that hurt our brand's exclusivity. The board members studied their papers, whispering among themselves. Douglas's smirk began to return as he watched his ally work. All those in favor of removing Calvin Rhodes as CEO? Harold called out. Hands raised around the room. Not all, but enough. Eleanor Vance jumped to her feet, protesting the legality of the vote. But Harold's lawyers were already stepping forward with more paperwork. The board has spoken, Harold announced. Mr. Rhodes, I believe security can show you out. 2 guards approached Calvin, looking uncomfortable but determined. Sophia stood up again, tears in her eyes, but Calvin shook his head slightly. A silent instruction for her to stay quiet, to keep her job, to fight another day. As Calvin was led toward the ballroom doors, camera flashes burst through the windows. Somehow, the press had been tipped off, their lenses capturing his exit in stark detail. Douglas moved to the front of the room, adjusting his tie and practicing his concerned expression for the cameras. Such a shame, Harold said loudly enough for the reporters to hear. But we must protect the hotel's interests. The board has lost confidence in Mr. Rhodes's judgment. Calvin walked out with his head high, each step measured and dignified despite the humiliation. The cameras continued to flash as security escorted him through the lobby he'd built, past the marble floors he'd chosen, under the chandeliers he'd selected piece by crystal piece. Douglas stood in the doorway, fully restored to his previous arrogance, watching his former boss's departure with undisguised satisfaction. The morning sun caught his teeth as he smiled for the photographers, already rehearsing sound bites about necessary changes and maintaining standards. Camera flashes burst like lightning around Calvin as he stood on the grand marble steps of his hotel. Microphones thrust toward his face while reporters shouted questions over each other. The morning sun beat down mercilessly, making his forehead shine with sweat. Mr. Rhodes, is it true you've lost control of the Grand Meridian? Were you removed for mismanagement? Sources say you've been acting erratically. Any comment? Before Calvin could respond, Douglas Harlan's smooth voice cut through the chaos. He emerged from the hotel's brass doors, Harold Kingston at his shoulder, both men radiating manufactured concern. Ladies and gentlemen, Douglas addressed the media, straightening his Italian silk tie. This is obviously a difficult day for everyone at the Grand Meridian. While we appreciate Mr. Rhodes's historical contributions, his recent behavior has grown increasingly concerning. Calvin's jaw tightened, but he maintained his dignified silence. In recent months, Douglas continued, Mr. Rhodes has shown signs of becoming detached from daily operations. He's made impulsive decisions, launched baseless investigations, and frankly, begun damaging the brand we've all worked so hard to build. Harold stepped forward, his expensive suit gleaming in the morning light. As board members, we have a fiduciary responsibility to protect shareholder interests. The decision to remove Mr. Rhodes was not made lightly, but it was necessary. A security guard approached Calvin, holding out his hand. I'm sorry, sir. I need your access cards and keys. Calvin slowly removed his credentials, handing them over without breaking eye contact with Douglas. The guard couldn't meet his gaze. Additionally, Douglas announced, we've had to terminate several employees who aided Mr. Rhodes in his unfortunate crusade, including Sophia Bennett, who breached multiple confidentiality agreements. Through the crowd, Calvin caught a glimpse of Sophia being escorted out a side entrance, clutching a cardboard box of personal items. Her eyes were red, but her head was held high. News vans with satellite dishes began arriving, their logos bright against the morning sky. Reporters typed frantically on phones as headlines started appearing on news websites. Hotel magnate ousted. Mental health concerns cited. Grand Meridian Board removes unstable founder. Sources question Rhodes's competence. Calvin turned away from the circus, walking steadily down the street despite the reporters trailing him. 3 blocks away, a small cafe provided refuge. Eleanor Vance already waited at a corner table, legal documents spread before her. "They're spinning this faster than I expected," Eleanor said, as Calvin sat down. She pushed a coffee toward him. "But you don't seem surprised." "Because I'm not." Calvin pulled a thick binder from his briefcase, the original company charter. "When you build something from nothing, you learn to watch your back." Eleanor leaned forward as Calvin opened to a marked page. "What am I looking at?" "Article 7, Section 12, Calvin said, pointing to a dense paragraph. "I added this clause 15 years ago. It restricts how shares can be transferred between board members and limits the formation of voting blocks." Eleanor's eyes widened as she read. This could invalidate Harold's recent moves. "Keep reading," Calvin said, turning to another flagged section. "There's more about proxy voting and holding companies. I grew up watching white businessmen steal from each other. Did they really think I wouldn't protect myself?" Calvin's phone buzzed, a message from his attorney that made him smile slightly. Harold rushed his share transfers, got sloppy with the paperwork. "According to my lawyer, at least 3 of his recent acquisitions violate charter terms." Eleanor pulled out her tablet, making rapid notes. "We'll need court orders, injunctions." "Already in motion," Calvin said. "I didn't build this company by being naive. Every time they blocked my loans, every time they rejected my permits, every time they tried to push me out of deals, I learned, I adapted, I planned." Through the cafe window, they could see more news vans arriving at the hotel. Douglas was still holding court on the steps, clearly enjoying his moment in the spotlight. "They think they've won," Eleanor observed. "They have no idea what's coming." "That's always been their weakness," Calvin replied, watching Douglas preen for the cameras. "They're so convinced of their superiority that they don't do their homework. They don't read the fine print." His phone buzzed again, another update from his legal team. The first motions were being filed. Soon, Harold's hasty power grab would start unraveling. Outside, the morning traffic flowed past the cafe windows. Inside, Calvin and Eleanor bent over documents, preparing their response. The media circus continued at the hotel, but Calvin paid it no attention. He had stopped playing to the cameras long ago. The real fight would happen in boardrooms and courtrooms, and he had spent decades preparing for exactly this moment. Douglas might be enjoying his temporary triumph on the hotel steps, and Harold might think his legal maneuvering was bulletproof. But Calvin had built his empire by outlasting men like them, by being smarter, by planning further ahead. He had anticipated betrayal because he had seen it so many times before. Eleanor gathered the documents, organizing them with practiced efficiency. The morning sun had climbed higher, burning away the last traces of dawn. In the distance, the Grand Meridian's windows blazed with reflected light, as if the building itself was watching, waiting to see what would happen next. The gleaming glass tower that housed Atlanta's most prestigious law offices stretched toward the clouds. Calvin rode the elevator to the 42nd floor, his reflection in the polished doors showing a man who appeared completely unfazed by the morning's events. Linda Carver's corner office offered a commanding view of downtown, but the corporate attorney paid no attention to the vista. She sat behind her massive desk, surrounded by stacks of legal documents, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she studied the hotel's charter. "They were sloppy," Linda said, without looking up as Calvin entered. "Arrogant and sloppy." She removed her glasses and fixed Calvin with her penetrating gaze, which works entirely in our favor. Calvin settled into one of the leather chairs facing her desk. Tell me exactly where they messed up. Linda pulled out a highlighted document. First, the charter explicitly requires unanimous consent from all primary shareholders for any removal of majority control. Harold may have consolidated votes, but he missed this crucial detail. She tapped the relevant paragraph with a manicured finger. And the share transfers? Calvin asked. Even worse. Linda spread out several forms. Harold tried to conceal his accumulation of shares through a series of holding companies, but he filed the paperwork incorrectly. 3 of the major transfers weren't properly registered with the SEC. That alone could invalidate the entire takeover attempt. Calvin nodded slowly. How quickly can we move? I've already drafted an emergency injunction. Linda pulled out a thick document. We can file within the hour. This will temporarily block any board actions until a full hearing. She paused, studying Calvin's face. They're going to fight this hard. Harold has connections throughout the system. Let them fight, Calvin replied calmly. I've dealt with men like Harold my entire career. They always underestimate what they're up against. Linda's phone buzzed. She glanced at the message and frowned. My contact at the hotel just informed me that Douglas is ordering a massive deletion of files. He's told IT to wipe the complaint archives and remove all audit documentation. Can they recover anything once it's deleted? Possibly, but it would be difficult to prove the files ever existed without backups. Calvin's phone vibrated in his pocket. A text from an unknown number. Meeting in person too risky. Sending secure link. Check email in 10 mins. S. He allowed himself a small smile. Sophia. Even after being fired, she was still fighting. Linda continued outlining their legal strategy as Calvin's email notification chimed. The subject line read simply, Backup files. Urgent. Excuse me, he said to Linda, opening his laptop. The email contained a secure link to a cloud drive. As the files downloaded, his eyes widened slightly. Sophia had been methodically backing up everything. Every discriminatory complaint Douglas had buried. Every suspicious financial transaction. Every altered record. She documented it all, creating time-stamped copies that couldn't be erased. Linda, Calvin said quietly, you need to see this. The attorney moved around her desk to look at his screen. Together, they began examining the files. The evidence was overwhelming. Bank statements showed millions in renovation funds diverted to shell companies. Email threads revealed Douglas and Harold coordinating to hide discrimination complaints. There were altered employee records, falsified guest incidents, and systematic manipulation of promotion decisions. This is far worse than we thought, Linda muttered, scrolling through the documents. They weren't just trying to push you out. They've been embezzling for years. Calvin opened another folder and froze. Look at this. It was a series of wire transfers linking Harold's personal accounts to the shell companies. Accompanying emails showed Douglas coordinating the transactions, complete with instructions for concealing the paper trail. This is exactly what we needed, Linda said, already reaching for her phone. I'm calling Judge Matthews. With evidence of criminal activity, we can get an immediate injunction and freeze their assets. Outside Linda's windows, the afternoon sun painted Atlanta's skyline in shades of gold. Traffic flowed far below, cars gleaming like toys. Inside the office, the air hummed with focused energy as Linda's team of paralegals began processing the new evidence. Calvin sat back in his chair, watching the controlled frenzy of legal activity. He thought of Sophia, risking everything to preserve the truth. He thought of Douglas, probably still gloating in his temporary victory. He thought of Harold, so certain of his own cleverness. Linda ended her call with the judge and turned to Calvin. The injunction will be signed within the hour. We're also alerting the SEC and the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. She allowed herself a rare smile. They didn't just overreach, Calvin. They left themselves wide open. How long until we can move? The injunction takes effect immediately upon signing. After that, we can file the criminal complaints. She checked her watch. Douglas and Harold probably think they have days or weeks to cover their tracks. They have no idea they only have minutes. Calvin nodded, his expression unchanged. But inside, he felt a deep satisfaction. Not because of the victory to come. He'd won plenty of battles before. No, this satisfaction came from knowing that justice would be served not through anger or force, but through patience, preparation, and truth. The afternoon sun continued its slow arc across the sky, casting long shadows through Linda's office. Her team worked with quiet intensity, preparing the avalanche of legal documents that would soon descend on the Grand Meridian. And through it all, Calvin sat perfectly still, watching the pieces fall into place, just as he had planned all along. The Atlanta County Courthouse stood like a stone guardian in the crisp morning air. Inside courtroom 312, Judge Rebecca Martinez surveyed the gathered parties with sharp eyes that had seen thousands of corporate disputes. Calvin sat beside Linda Carver at the plaintiff's table, his posture relaxed but alert. Across the aisle, Harold Kingston's expensive suit couldn't hide his tension. Douglas Harlan kept shifting in his chair, tugging at his collar. "Your Honor," Linda began, rising with a stack of documents. "This is a clear violation of the Grand Meridian Hotel's founding charter." She approached the bench, handing over highlighted copies. Section 7, Paragraph 3 explicitly requires unanimous consent from all primary shareholders for removal of majority control. The judge studied the document carefully. "Mr. Kingston, your response?" Harold's attorney stood, smoothing his tie. "Your Honor, the board acted within its rights to protect shareholder interests. Mr. Rhodes's behavior. The charter supersedes standard board authority," Linda interrupted. "Furthermore, we've uncovered serious irregularities in recent share transfers." She produced another set of documents. These transactions, orchestrated by Mr. Kingston through various holding companies, were improperly filed with the SEC. Judge Martinez examined the new evidence. Douglas's face had grown increasingly pale. Harold maintained his composed expression, but his fingers drummed silently on the table. "Your Honor," Harold's attorney tried again. "These are merely technical oversights." "Technical oversights that violate federal securities law," Linda stated firmly. "We're prepared to present evidence of additional financial improprieties." The judge held up her hand. "I've seen enough regarding the charter violation." She looked directly at Harold and Douglas. "The board's actions are hereby suspended. I'm granting temporary reinstatement of Mr. Rhodes's authority, pending full review." Calvin remained perfectly still, but Sophia, watching from the gallery, noticed the slight relaxation of his shoulders. "Mr. Rhodes will resume operational control immediately," Judge Martinez continued. "All access credentials are to be restored within the hour." She fixed Harold with a stern look. "And, Mr. Kingston, I strongly suggest you prepare for SEC inquiries regarding those share transfers." Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed the steps. Camera flashes burst like lightning as Calvin emerged into the sunlight. "Mr. Rhodes, how do you respond to allegations of instability? What's your message to the board?" Calvin paused, adjusting his tie. "The Grand Meridian was built on principles of excellence and integrity. Today's ruling helps ensure those principles remain intact." His voice carried clearly across the crowd. "I look forward to working with our dedicated staff to maintain the highest standards of service and transparency." The headlines shifted within hours. "Hotel owner prevails. Judge overturns board's improper actions. Grand Meridian dispute. Questions raised about share transfers. Rhodes returns. Landmark Hotel faces leadership shakeup." By early afternoon, Calvin walked through the Grand Meridian's lobby, his access badge restored. Staff members straightened as he passed, some offering quiet smiles. The whispers followed him. "Did you hear? Mr. Rhodes is back. They say Kingston's in trouble with the SEC. About time somebody stood up to Douglas." In his office, Calvin's first action was to call Sophia. She arrived minutes later, still wearing the same clothes from the courthouse. "Ms. Bennett," Calvin said warmly, "I believe we have an opening for a general manager position." Someone with integrity, intelligence, and a proven commitment to our values. Sophia's eyes widened. Mr. Rhodes, You risked your job to stand up for what's right, Calvin continued. That's exactly the kind of leadership we need. Tears threatened at the corners of Sophia's eyes, but she blinked them back. Thank you, sir. I won't let you down. I know you won't. Calvin handed her a folder. Your first task is to help oversee our new transparency audit. Every complaint, every financial record, every hiring decision, everything gets reviewed. Throughout the afternoon, the hotel's atmosphere transformed. Douglas's office stood empty, his personal items already cleared out. Staff moved with renewed energy, speaking more freely. Even the sunlight through the grand windows seemed brighter. Calvin spent hours meeting with department heads, emphasizing his commitment to fair treatment and open communication. He authorized immediate review of all denied promotions and buried complaints. The hotel hummed with purposeful activity. At 6 o'clock, he sat down at his computer to begin examining the financial records himself. Years of experience had taught him to verify everything personally. He opened the main accounting database and began searching for specific transaction records from the past 3 years. Error messages popped up. File not found. Document unavailable. Access denied. Calvin frowned, trying different search parameters. More errors. He called IT. Sir, the technician explained, those records, they're just gone. Completely wiped. Even our backup servers are clean. Calvin leaned back in his chair, staring at the error messages blinking on his screen. The critical files documenting years of transactions, the very evidence needed to prove the full scope of Harold and Douglas's schemes, had vanished without a trace. Through his office windows, he could see the Atlanta skyline darkening as evening settled over the city. The hotel's lights flickered on automatically, casting a warm glow through the corridors. In offices and suites throughout the building, staff and guests went about their business, most unaware that beneath the surface of this apparent victory, a deeper battle was still unfolding. The Grand Meridian's administrative office hummed with the soft whir of servers at midnight. Calvin's tie hung loose around his neck as he leaned over Sophia's shoulder. Both of them bathed in the blue glow of multiple computer screens. Try the backup from March, Calvin suggested, rubbing his tired eyes. Sophia's fingers flew across the keyboard. Nothing. It's like they knew exactly which files to target. She pushed back from the desk, frustration evident in her slumped shoulders. They've wiped everything, showing the money trail. The IT director, Marcus Webb, stood nearby clutching his fourth coffee of the night. We've checked every server, Mr. Rhodes. The deletion was thorough and professional. Someone knew our system inside and out. Calvin paced the length of the small room, his footsteps muffled by industrial carpet. What about the cloud backups? Marcus shook his head. Compromised. The files were replaced with corrupted data weeks ago. By the time anyone noticed, the original versions were already overwritten in the automatic backup cycle. And the transfers? Calvin asked. Sophia pulled up a simplified diagram on her screen. We can see money left these accounts. She pointed to several boxes representing hotel holdings. But the destination accounts are masked through a series of offshore shells. Without the original documentation showing authorization and routing, proving who ordered the transfers is nearly impossible. The room fell silent, except for the constant hum of machinery. Calvin stopped at the window, staring at his reflection overlaid against the city lights below. The hotel's distinctive silhouette dominated the skyline, its illuminated windows forming a pattern he knew by heart. He'd built this place from nothing, and now paper trails were vanishing into thin air. His phone buzzed, another message from Linda Carver. Harold Kingston filed defamation countersuit, seeking $50 million damages. Need to discuss strategy. Sophia saw his expression darken. More bad news? Harold's fighting back. Calvin showed her the message. He knows without those records, we can't prove the financial misconduct. Now he's trying to bury us in legal fees. Marcus cleared his throat. Sir, there's more. The stock price dropped 12% today. The market's nervous about the leadership dispute. Major investors are already calling for a settlement, Sophia added quietly. They're worried about prolonged litigation hurting the brand. Calvin's phone buzzed again. This time it was an email from his accountant detailing the mounting legal expenses. The numbers made his jaw clench. Across town, in an upscale bar overlooking the city, Douglas Harlan raised his glass in a private toast. He sat in a dimly lit corner booth, surrounded by dark wood paneling and soft jazz music. His smirk reflected in the crystal tumbler. "To digital cleaning services," he murmured to himself, savoring expensive bourbon. The evening news played silently on a wall-mounted screen, showing footage of that morning's court hearing. Douglas watched with satisfaction as his own face appeared, projecting practiced concern about Calvin's erratic behavior. Without proof of wrongdoing, it was his word against Calvin's, and Douglas had years of practice at making his words sound reasonable, measured, concerned about the company's well-being. The board would back him. They always did when profits were at stake. Back in the administrative office, Sophia refused to give up. She dug through folder after folder of system logs, looking for any trace of the deleted files. Calvin maintained his quiet vigil by the window, phone buzzing periodically with more messages from worried investors. "Wait," Marcus said suddenly, straightening up from where he'd been examining a secondary monitor. "Look at this access log." Sophia rolled her chair over. "What did you find?" "It's not about the files, but—" Marcus highlighted a series of entries. "There's something odd about the physical access records from last month. Multiple after-hours entries to restricted areas, authorized with an executive code." Calvin joined them, studying the log. "Whose code?" "Harold Kingston's," Sophia read. "But why would he need to access the accounting offices at 2 a.m.? Calvin's eyes narrowed. "Check the security cameras." Marcus pulled up the archive of external security footage. The system maintained rolling footage for 60 days, primarily covering building entrances and the parking structure. He scrolled back through the dates, matching them to the access log entries. The first few clips showed nothing unusual: dark, empty corridors, and occasional security patrols. Then, on a Tuesday night 3 weeks ago, a familiar figure appeared. Harold Kingston, supposedly out of town at a conference, slipped through the service entrance at 1:47 a.m. He carried a slim briefcase and moved with purpose, clearly familiar with the camera locations. "There," Calvin pointed. "Follow his path." They watched as Harold made his way to the executive floor, disappearing into the accounting department. He emerged 2 hours later, briefcase noticeably fuller. "He must have been copying files before deleting them," Sophia said, making sure he had evidence to protect himself before destroying it. "Classic Harold," Calvin muttered, "always keeping leverage." Marcus rubbed his eyes. "But this doesn't help us recover the actual files." "No," Calvin agreed, studying Harold's grainy image frozen on the screen. "But it shows he was here when he claimed to be in Chicago, and it proves he accessed sensitive areas without authorization. His executive code wasn't valid for accounting after business hours." Sophia straightened in her chair. "So we can prove he lied about his whereabouts and violated security protocols. It's not financial fraud, but it's something," Calvin finished. "Something concrete. Something that raises questions about his testimony and character." The security footage continued to play silently on the screen, showing Harold's furtive exit from the building. In the harsh parking lot lights, his face showed none of the polished confidence he displayed in board meetings. Instead, his expression was haunted, hurried, the look of a man who knew he was crossing lines that couldn't be uncrossed. Calvin stood in the dim conference room, alone now, except for the gentle hum of the ventilation system. The scattered papers and empty coffee cups testified to hours of searching. But it was this one detail, captured by an ordinary security camera, that held his attention. On the screen before him, Harold Kingston slipped through shadows he thought would hide him forever. The Federal Building's third-floor conference room felt worlds away from the Grand Meridian's polished luxury. Plain white walls, functional furniture, and fluorescent lighting created an atmosphere of serious purpose. Calvin Rhodes sat at the long table beside Eleanor Vance, spreading documents across the scratched surface, while federal investigator Daniel Ruiz reviewed each piece with methodical attention. These discrimination complaints span 3 years, Calvin explained, sliding forward a thick folder. Each one was buried or dismissed without proper review. Ruiz, his suit jacket draped over his chair, made careful notes in precise handwriting. His face remained neutral, but his eyes sparked with recognition at certain details. "And you have proof these were deliberately suppressed?" "Here." Eleanor produced a USB drive. Audio recordings of Douglas Harlan instructing staff to discourage certain demographics and maintain the right image. He was careful with his language in emails, but got bolder in person. Ruiz plugged the drive into his laptop, listening through an earpiece. His jaw tightened at certain passages. This establishes pattern and intent. The civil rights violations alone are significant. Calvin nodded, then shifted to another stack of papers. "The financial evidence is here. We managed to preserve some records before the mass deletion. These show systematic embezzlement through shell companies, all tied to renovation projects that never happened." "The money trail is complex," Eleanor added, spreading out a diagram. "But we traced it through multiple offshore accounts before the records disappeared. Harold Kingston's fingerprints are all over the transactions." Ruiz studied the flowchart, his expression sharpening. "This matches patterns we've seen in other corporate fraud cases. They got sloppy with the routing." He turned to the security footage playing silently on his laptop. Harold Kingston's after-hours visits played in sequence, damning in their furtiveness. This helps establish timeline and intent. He knew exactly what he was doing. "They thought destroying records would protect them," Calvin said quietly. "But we had backup systems they didn't know about." Eleanor smiled tightly. "Never underestimate old-school paper trails and offline storage." Ruiz's pen moved steadily across his notepad. "The combination of evidence is compelling. Securities fraud from the hidden transfers. Civil rights violations from systematic discrimination. Embezzlement through the shell companies." He looked up at Calvin. "This will take time to build properly, but we have enough to move forward." "How long?" Calvin asked. "We'll begin immediately. My team has been briefed and is ready, but we need to coordinate with multiple divisions." Ruiz checked his watch. "I can have agents in place by morning." Eleanor leaned forward. "They're planning to force a private buyout. If they succeed, they'll bury everything. We'll move before that happens," Ruiz assured her. He turned to Calvin. "You've maintained your temporary reinstatement?" "Yes, but I've stayed away from the hotel. Let them think they've won." "Good. Keep that impression. We don't want them destroying any remaining evidence." Through the conference room's windows, the city sprawled gray and hazy in the early morning light. Traffic moved steadily on the streets below as people went about their normal routines, unaware of the machinery of justice grinding into motion above them. Ruiz made several phone calls, speaking in clipped tones about warrant details and team coordination. Eleanor reviewed final documentation with Calvin, ensuring every piece of evidence was properly logged and copied. In his temporary office across town, Douglas Harlan scrolled through property valuations and market analyses. The buyout papers sat ready on his desk, Harold's signature already in place. He'd scheduled the board meeting for tomorrow, confident in their majority control. Soon the hotel would be theirs to reshape. No more interference from Calvin's outdated ideals about equality and opportunity. His phone buzzed with a text from Harold. "Everything set for tomorrow? Need this wrapped up clean." Douglas typed back quickly. "All arranged. Board's on board. He won't know what hit him." Harold's response came seconds later. "Good. Delete this thread." At the Federal Building, Ruiz concluded his calls and faced Calvin and Eleanor. "Teams are mobilizing now. We'll coordinate with local authorities as needed." He handed Calvin his card. "Stay reachable, but maintain normal routine. We don't want to spook them." "What about the staff?" Calvin asked. "Many of them provided evidence at great risk." We'll protect them, Ruiz promised. Whistleblower statutes are clear. Ms. Bennett, in particular, will be fully covered. Eleanor gathered her papers. I'll make sure the board understands the legal implications once this breaks. Many of them were misled about the extent of the fraud. They stood, the weight of what was coming settling around them. Through the windows, the Grand Meridian's distinctive silhouette rose against the brightening sky. Soon its carefully maintained facade would crack, revealing the rot beneath. Ruiz walked them to the elevator. We'll be in position before business hours. Unmarked vehicles, plain-clothes agents. Standard procedure for white-collar cases. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime. Calvin stepped in, then turned back to Ruiz. Thank you for taking this seriously. Financial crimes destroy lives just as surely as violent ones, Ruiz replied. They just do it in smaller cuts, over time. But justice catches up eventually. As Calvin and Eleanor descended to the lobby, federal agents across the city began their final preparations. Evidence teams reviewed warrant details. Forensic accountants stood ready to seize records. Field agents checked equipment and coordinated positions. The morning sun climbed higher, catching the Grand Meridian's windows in sheets of gold. Near the hotel's service entrance, an unmarked sedan parked quietly. Two more took positions at strategic corners. Inside each vehicle, agents waited patiently, radios silent but ready. In his office, Douglas straightened his tie and practiced his triumphant smile for tomorrow's board meeting, blissfully unaware of the net closing around him. The morning sun streamed through the Grand Meridian's towering glass facade, casting long shadows across the marble lobby floor. Douglas Harlan stood behind the polished front desk, his posture radiating satisfaction as he observed the steady flow of departing guests. His crisp navy suit and perfectly knotted tie projected the image of unshakable authority he'd worked so hard to maintain. "Everything to your satisfaction, Mrs. Davidson?" he asked a wealthy regular guest, his practiced smile never wavering. "We look forward to your next stay." Several floors above, Harold Kingston sat in his private corner office, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows and expensive artwork. Spread across his mahogany desk were documents detailing the upcoming board vote and buyout strategy. His silver pen tapped rhythmically against the papers as he reviewed the final details. The lobby's gentle murmur of conversation and rolling luggage suddenly shifted. Heads turned as a group of men and women in dark suits entered through the revolving doors with purposeful strides. Federal investigator Daniel Ruiz led the way, his badge already in hand. "Everyone stay calm and continue about your business," Ruiz announced in a clear, authoritative voice. "We're conducting a federal investigation." Guests pressed themselves against the walls, phones appearing to record the scene. Douglas's smile froze as two agents approached the front desk. "Mr. Harlan," Ruiz stated, placing a warrant on the counter, "we need to discuss some matters regarding discriminatory practices and destruction of evidence." Douglas's face flushed. "This is ridiculous. I have nothing to—" "Sir, we have recorded evidence of you instructing staff to profile guests and suppress complaints," Ruiz cut in. "We'll need you to step aside and remain available for questioning." Upstairs, the scene in Harold Kingston's office unfolded with military precision. Agents entered without knocking, warranted in hand. "Mr. Kingston, step away from the desk," the lead agent ordered. "Do not touch any electronic devices or documents." Harold's face drained of color as he watched agents begin systematically photographing and bagging evidence. His computer was quickly disconnected and sealed in an evidence bag. "This is outrageous," Harold blustered, straightening his tie with trembling fingers. "I demand to speak with my attorney." "You'll have that opportunity," the agent replied, unmoved. "Right now, you're under arrest for securities fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to destroy evidence." In the lobby, staff gathered in small clusters, whispering as they watched the scene unfold. Sophia Bennett stood near the concierge desk, her expression a mixture of vindication and disbelief. "Those after-hours visits," one security guard muttered. Kingston was always here late, accessing the server room. And all those complaints that disappeared, a front desk clerk added. Douglas made us delete them. Douglas's composure began to crack as he watched more agents emerge from the elevators with boxes of evidence. His perfectly maintained facade showed hairline fractures, a bead of sweat on his forehead, a slight tremor in his hands. This is a mistake, he insisted, voice rising. We operate within all legal guidelines. Our standards are... Your standards included systematic discrimination and financial fraud, Ruiz interrupted coldly. We have extensive documentation. The lobby fell silent as Harold Kingston appeared, escorted by agents. His hands were cuffed in front of him, his expensive suit wrinkled from the search. Guest phones recorded as he was led across the same marble floor where days earlier he had helped orchestrate Calvin's humiliation. Harold's face was ashen as camera flashes erupted from the gathering news crews outside. Reporters pressed against the glass, capturing every moment of his walk of shame. Mr. Kingston, did you orchestrate the attempted takeover? Were you aware of the discrimination complaints? How long has the embezzlement been going on? The questions followed him through the revolving doors. Douglas watched helplessly as his powerful ally was guided into a waiting federal vehicle. The morning sun caught the polished brass of the revolving doors as they turned again. Calvin Rhodes stepped through, his presence commanding immediate attention. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that contrasted sharply with the worn jeans from his undercover visit. His expression was neutral as he observed the scene before him. Ruiz nodded respectfully in Calvin's direction. Mr. Rhodes, we're proceeding, as discussed. Douglas's last threads of composure snapped. You planned this? Justice plans itself, Mr. Harlan, Calvin replied calmly. I just made sure the evidence was preserved. Staff members straightened their postures, some smiling openly now as Calvin walked past. Sophia stepped forward to hand him a folder. The updated staff reports you requested, Mr. Rhodes, she said clearly. Thank you, Ms. Bennett, Calvin replied. Please inform all department heads. There will be a full staff meeting this afternoon. Through the front windows, they could see Harold Kingston sitting in the back of the federal vehicle, his head bowed. News crews continued filming as more agents emerged with evidence boxes. Calvin stood quietly in his lobby, watching the scene unfold. His hotel's marble floors gleamed beneath his feet, the same floors he'd been deemed unworthy to walk on just days before. But his expression held no triumph, only calm certainty that justice had finally arrived at the Grand Meridian's gilded doors. The Grand Meridian's ballroom sparkled under crystal chandeliers, their light catching on gilded moldings and polished surfaces. By late morning, the space had transformed into a media center. Television cameras lined the back wall, their red recording lights blinking steadily. Journalists filled the rows of hastily arranged chairs, notebooks open and pens poised. Hotel employees gathered along the walls, their usual professional masks unable to hide their tension. Sophia Bennett stood near the main entrance, her badge proudly displayed after her recent reinstatement. Around her, housekeepers, bellhops, and desk staff whispered among themselves, their eyes fixed on the podium at the front of the room. The ambient noise died as Calvin Rhodes stepped up to the microphone. He wore the same impeccable charcoal suit from earlier, his presence commanding attention without demanding it. To his right stood federal investigator Daniel Ruiz, his expression stern and professional. "Good morning," Calvin began, his voice steady and clear. "I've called this press conference to address serious issues uncovered at the Grand Meridian Hotel. As founder and majority owner, I have a responsibility to our guests, our employees, and our community to ensure transparency." Camera shutters clicked rapidly as he pulled out a folder of documents. "During a recent undercover assessment of our operations, I personally experienced and documented systematic discrimination against guests of color." Calvin's words carried weight without anger. Further investigation revealed extensive financial fraud and ethical violations under the management of Douglas Harlan. Douglas stood at the back of the room, his face reddening as cameras turned toward him. His usual polished appearance showed signs of strain, his tie slightly askew, his jacket wrinkled from nervous adjustments. "Mr. Ruiz," Calvin gestured to the federal investigator, "will outline the criminal charges now being pursued." Ruiz stepped forward, adjusting the microphone. "This morning, we arrested Harold Kingston on multiple counts of securities fraud and embezzlement. Our investigation has uncovered approximately $12 million in misappropriated funds through falsified renovation contracts and offshore accounts." Murmurs rippled through the assembled press. Phones rose higher to capture every word. "Additionally," Ruiz continued, "we are reviewing extensive evidence of civil rights violations in hotel operations, including documented patterns of discrimination in guest services and employee advancement." Douglas shifted his weight, tugging at his collar. The same employees he'd lorded over for years now watched him with unveiled contempt. "That's absurd," Douglas called out, his voice sharp with desperate authority. "We maintain the highest standards of—" "Perhaps we should let your own words speak to those standards, Mr. Harlan," Calvin interrupted calmly. He nodded to a technician in the corner. The ballroom's speaker system crackled to life with Douglas's voice, recorded weeks earlier. "I don't care what their reservation says. Find a reason to downgrade them. We have standards to maintain, and certain elements don't belong in our premium suites." Gasps echoed through the ballroom. Douglas's face went pale. Another recording played. "If they can't afford room service every night, they shouldn't be here. Make them feel it. We know how to handle their kind." Journalists scribbled furiously. Several employees along the walls nodded grimly, finally hearing public confirmation of what they'd witnessed for years. "That's taken out of context," Douglas protested, his voice rising. "You can't possibly—" "We have hours of similar recordings," Calvin stated, "along with documented complaints that were deliberately suppressed and testimony from current and former staff members who were instructed to participate in discriminatory practices." The parallel to Calvin's own humiliation in the lobby days earlier hung heavy in the air. Douglas had sneered at him then, assuming power meant never facing consequences. Now the truth stood in full light, and there was nowhere to hide. "The Grand Meridian was founded on principles of excellence and inclusion," Calvin continued. "My own experience building this company taught me that true luxury is measured by how we treat all people, not by how exclusively we can discriminate." Sophia straightened her shoulders, pride replacing the fear that had dominated her workdays under Douglas's regime. Around her, other employees stood taller, as if physical weights were lifting from their shoulders. "Therefore, effective immediately, Douglas Harlan is terminated from all managerial authority at the Grand Meridian Hotel. His access credentials have been revoked, and he will be escorted from the property following this conference." Douglas stood frozen, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. The applause that rose wasn't the celebratory kind that followed victories or achievements. It was the sound of relief, of pressure finally releasing, of truth finally breaking through years of suppressed injustice. Staff members who had suffered under his authority clapped slowly, their eyes fixed on his diminishing figure. Journalists joined in, recognizing the weight of the moment. The sound filled the ballroom, echoing off the crystal chandeliers that had witnessed so many of Douglas's casual cruelties. Calvin remained at the podium, his posture straight but not triumphant. He watched Douglas with the same calm dignity he'd maintained when Douglas had humiliated him in the lobby. The applause continued, washing over the room like a cleansing wave. Security personnel moved quietly into position near Douglas, ready to escort him out. His hands hung limply at his sides, his carefully maintained image of authority stripped away, leaving only the truth of who he had always been. Afternoon sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Calvin Rhodes's executive office, casting long shadows across the polished mahogany desk. The view of downtown Atlanta stretched out beyond the glass, a reminder of the heights from which Douglas Harlan had fallen. Douglas sat rigidly in one of the leather guest chairs, his once pristine suit now wrinkled from the stress of the morning's press conference. His usual swagger had evaporated, replaced by the tense posture of a man awaiting sentence. Across the massive desk, Calvin Rhodes maintained the same calm demeanor he'd shown throughout the entire ordeal. Sophia Bennett stood quietly to Calvin's right, her presence a silent testament to the changes sweeping through the Grand Meridian. The office felt different now. The same space where Douglas had once plotted with Harold Kingston now held the weight of accountability. Family photos lined Calvin's shelves, glimpses of the journey that had brought him from rural Georgia to ownership of this luxury hotel. Each image seemed to watch Douglas, reminding him of the humanity he'd dismissed so casually. "I assume you're going to have me arrested," Douglas said, breaking the heavy silence. His voice lacked its usual condescension. "Or at least ensure I never work in hospitality again." Calvin studied him for a long moment, his fingers laced together on the desk. That would be the expected course of action, wouldn't it? He opened a thick folder in front of him. "We have documented evidence of discriminatory practices spanning your entire tenure as general manager. Dozens of guests profiled and humiliated. Qualified staff members denied advancement based on race." Douglas's jaw clenched. Sweat beaded at his temples despite the room's perfect climate control. "The legal team believes we have enough evidence for criminal charges related to civil rights violations," Calvin continued, his tone measured. "The Justice Department is particularly interested in the pattern of coordinated discrimination." Sophia shifted slightly, remembering countless moments when Douglas had forced her to participate in his prejudiced protocols. The memory of his smirk as he'd downgraded guests still made her stomach turn. "I was maintaining standards," Douglas attempted weakly. "The hotel's reputation was built by the very people you deemed unworthy," Calvin cut in, his voice sharp for the first time. "I founded this hotel because I understood both sides of that front desk. I knew what it meant to be judged before speaking a single word." Douglas's shoulders sagged. The reality of his situation seemed to finally pierce his armor of entitlement. Fear crept into his eyes, not just of punishment, but of the complete dismantling of his worldview. Calvin pulled another document from the folder. "However, I believe true accountability requires more than punishment. It requires transformation." He slid the paper across the desk. "This is a different kind of proposal." Douglas leaned forward, scanning the document with confusion. "Probation? 1 year minimum," Calvin confirmed. "You would remain employed at the Grand Meridian, but under strict conditions. No management authority, no influence over policy or personnel, no special privileges." Sophia watched Douglas's face as the terms sank in. She remembered his cruel smile in the hallway that first night, when he'd orchestrated the harassment of the man he hadn't known was his boss. Now that same man was offering him a path to redemption rather than ruin. "During this probationary period," Calvin continued, "you will work directly with our diversity and inclusion team. You'll participate in every training session. You'll learn the stories of the people you discriminated against. You'll understand the impact of your actions not through punishment, but through experience." Douglas's hands trembled slightly as he read through the document. "And if I refuse? Then we proceed with criminal referral," Calvin stated simply. "The evidence won't disappear just because you decline this opportunity. But I believe people can change when they're forced to see through others' eyes." The office fell silent again. Outside, the afternoon sun caught the windows of neighboring buildings, reflecting light that danced across the ceiling. Douglas stared at the document, his world of privilege and power reduced to a simple choice: transform or face the consequences of his actions. "What?" Douglas swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. "What role would I hold during this probation?" Calvin reached into his desk drawer. The sound seemed to echo in the tense quiet. Slowly, deliberately, he withdrew a pressed uniform and placed it on the desk between them. The navy fabric bore the Grand Meridian's gold insignia, the same uniform worn by the staff members Douglas had treated with such disdain. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Douglas stared at the uniform, his face a complex mixture of humiliation and dawning comprehension. This was more than punishment. It was an opportunity to rebuild himself from the ground up, to learn the humanity he'd denied in others. Sophia watched his reaction, remembering all the times she'd wanted to speak up against his cruelty, but feared losing her job. Now he would work alongside the very people he'd belittled, experience their daily reality, and perhaps finally understand the damage his prejudice had caused. "The choice is yours, Mr. Harlan," Calvin said quietly. "Transformation or prosecution? Which path will you take?" The morning sun hadn't yet reached the service corridors of the Grand Meridian Hotel. Douglas Harlan stood awkwardly in his new Navy maintenance uniform, the fabric still stiff and unfamiliar against his skin. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows in the windowless hallway, where staff he'd barely acknowledged had worked for years. Robert Ellis, the facilities supervisor, studied the clipboard in his hands. His weathered face showed no pleasure or spite at his new worker's circumstances, just the focused expression of someone with a job to do. "Morning shift starts at 6 sharp, Robert explained, his voice matter of fact. "We handle basic maintenance, housekeeping support, and general cleaning throughout the public areas." He glanced up at Douglas. "I understand you have experience managing the property, but down here, we focus on keeping it running." Douglas nodded stiffly, his throat tight. The employee entrance he'd used that morning was a far cry from his usual private parking spot. The break room where he'd changed into his uniform smelled of coffee and cleaning supplies, not the premium blend served in his former office. "Start with the main lobby," Robert instructed, handing him a mop and bucket. "Work your way from the entrance to the elevators. Pay special attention to high-traffic areas." The same lobby where Douglas had once strutted in designer suits now waited for his attention with a different purpose. As he pushed the cleaning cart through the service door, the morning light streamed through the grand windows, catching dust motes in golden beams. Early guests wheeled luggage across the floor he needed to clean. Douglas kept his head down, acutely aware of how invisible he felt in the uniform. A woman in business attire brushed past without a glance, her heels clicking on the marble. The same marble he'd used to judge Calvin Rhodes just days ago. From the second-floor balcony, Calvin observed quietly. He stood near the railing, watching Douglas navigate his new role with the same careful attention he'd given every aspect of the hotel's transformation. The lobby slowly filled with morning activity. Front desk staff greeted guests with warm professionalism. Tours departed for Atlanta's attractions. Douglas worked methodically, learning the rhythm of cleaning around moving feet, apologizing when his cart blocked someone's path. "Excuse me," a guest called out sharply. "There's a spill by the coffee station." Douglas looked up, recognizing the tone he'd often used himself, that note of command that assumed immediate service. He moved quickly to address the mess, aware of how his back ached from the morning's work. The guest didn't wait for his response or meet his eyes. Near the front desk, Sophia Bennett conducted her first morning briefing as general manager. Her navy suit and confident posture reflected her new authority, but her tone remained warm as she addressed the department heads. "Mr. Rhodes has approved immediate implementation of our new inclusion training program," she announced. "All staff will participate, regardless of position or seniority. We are also establishing a community advisory board to ensure our practices reflect our values." The assembled managers nodded, some taking notes. There was no resistance to these changes. Harold Kingston's arrest and Douglas's demotion had made it clear that the old guard's power was gone. Douglas worked his way across the lobby, learning the proper technique for the marble floors. Each stroke of the mop revealed the complexity of a job he'd never considered. His hands, soft from years behind a desk, developed their first blisters. Throughout the day, he experienced countless small moments of insight. He felt the strain of standing for hours, the frustration of cleaned areas immediately marked by muddy shoes, the ache of being treated as part of the background. Lunch meant a quick sandwich in the staff break room, not leisurely business meetings at upscale restaurants. In the afternoon, he cleaned the executive offices, his old domain. Through the windows, he could see his former parking space, now occupied by Sophia's modest sedan. The nameplate on his old door had already been changed. Inside, the office had been transformed. Family photos and community awards replacing the stark corporate decor he'd preferred. As the day progressed, Douglas noticed small kindnesses he'd overlooked before. Robert quietly showing him easier ways to lift heavy loads. A housekeeper offering him spare gloves when his grew soaked. The kitchen staff including him in their coffee break, despite his former treatment of them. The setting sun cast long shadows through the lobby windows as Douglas finished his shift. Most guests had retired to their rooms or ventured out for dinner. The marble floor reflected the warm light as he made his final pass with the mop. His arms ached. His feet throbbed in the sturdy work shoes that had replaced his Italian leather Oxfords. The day had taught him more about the hotel's true operation than years of management reports. As he worked near the front entrance, movement caught his eye. Calvin Rhodes stood by the reception desk, reviewing the day's reports with Sophia. Their eyes met briefly across the lobby, the same spot where Douglas had tried to humiliate him just days before. There was no smugness in Calvin's expression, no pleasure in Douglas's dissent. Instead, his gaze held only the steady weight of natural consequence. Douglas looked away first, continuing his work on the marble floor that had once been his stage for prejudice and pride. The gentle swish of the mop filled the quiet lobby as day faded to evening, each stroke another lesson in humility. The Grand Meridian's lobby sparkled in the morning light, its marble floors reflecting the diverse tapestry of guests moving through the space. Where tension and exclusion once ruled, warmth and welcome now flowed as naturally as the sunlight streaming through the towering windows. Sophia Bennett stood at the front desk, her presence both professional and approachable. She greeted an elderly couple checking in, their granddaughter bouncing excitedly beside them. "Welcome to the Grand Meridian," she said, her smile genuine. "We're so happy to have you with us." The transformation wasn't just superficial. Throughout the lobby, staff members of various backgrounds assisted guests with natural ease. A young black concierge confidently recommended restaurants to a group of executives. A Hispanic bellhop chatted in Spanish with international visitors, making them feel at home. At a corner table, two community leaders met over coffee, their animated discussion punctuated by appreciative gestures at their surroundings. One of them, Reverend Marcus Thompson, had publicly praised the hotel's reforms at last week's City Council meeting. "The Grand Meridian," he'd declared, "has become a model of what true hospitality should be." The quarterly financial reports on Sophia's desk told their own story of transformation. Guest satisfaction scores had risen dramatically. Bookings were up, particularly for conferences focused on diversity and inclusion. Several investors who'd wavered during the crisis had not only returned but increased their stakes. Near the entrance, a maintenance worker in a Navy uniform carefully polished the brass railings of the grand staircase. Douglas Harlan's shoulders no longer carried their former rigid pride, his movements now measured and humble. The past months of physical labor had changed him visibly. His hands were calloused, his designer watch replaced by a simple timepiece, his previously immaculate hair showing traces of gray. The morning sun caught the brass as he worked, creating little starbursts of light. Douglas paid careful attention to each spot, no longer rushing through tasks he once considered beneath him. The guest complaints about his attitude had stopped entirely. Instead, his supervisor regularly noted his thoroughness and willingness to help others. Calvin Rhodes emerged from the elevator, his presence drawing naturally respectful greets from staff and guests alike. He wore a simple but well-tailored suit, his manner relaxed but observant. A bellhop called out a cheerful good morning. A housekeeper paused in her duties to share a genuine smile with him. These weren't the forced deferences of before, but authentic expressions of respect. He stopped to chat with a family checking out, asking about their stay. Their young daughter proudly showed him a drawing she'd made of the hotel's fountain. Calvin knelt to admire it properly, making the child beam with pride. As he crossed the lobby, he noted the small but significant changes that marked the hotel's evolution. The art on the walls now celebrated local artists of various backgrounds. The shop displays featured products from minority-owned businesses. Even the piano music floating through the space included jazz and soul alongside classical pieces. Douglas remained focused on his work as Calvin approached, but his body language showed awareness of his former victim's presence. There was no trace of his previous smugness, no hint of the man who'd once tried to humiliate the hotel's owner. Calvin paused beside him, observing the careful attention Douglas gave to each section of railing. The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken history. "Luxury is not marble floors," Calvin said evenly, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "It's character." Douglas's hands stilled on the railing. He looked up slowly, meeting Calvin's gaze with clear eyes that showed understanding rather than resentment. He nodded once, the gesture carrying the humility of someone who'd learned their lesson through experience rather than words. Calvin moved on, leaving Douglas to his work. The former manager returned to his task, but his movements seemed to carry new purpose, not just cleaning brass, but building character. Near the front entrance, Sophia wrapped up a conversation with a corporate client who'd just booked a major conference. Her management style had proven to be exactly what the hotel needed. Firm but fair, professional but warm, focused on excellence while never losing sight of humanity. The morning sun poured through the glass facade as Calvin joined her, creating a warm glow that seemed to highlight the positive energy flowing through the space. Together, they watched the lobby's natural rhythm, guests arriving with excitement, departing with satisfaction, staff working with pride and purpose. A young black family entered through the revolving doors, their eyes wide as they took in the grandeur. The father carried their luggage, while their mother guided two small children who pointed excitedly at the crystal chandelier. Sophia immediately moved to welcome them personally, her genuine warmth setting them at ease. The scene was everything the Grand Meridian was meant to be, not just a luxury hotel, but a space where every guest felt valued, where every employee could work with dignity, where character mattered more than status. The marble floors gleamed beneath their feet, but it was the invisible foundation of integrity that truly made the space shine. If you enjoyed the story, leave a like to support my channel, and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. On the screen, I have picked two special stories just for you. Have a wonderful day.